This 17-year-old boy had a deep fascination with war, but after joining World War I, everything he saw on the battlefield changed his feelings about it. At first, he thought war was heroic and exciting, but as he witnessed death and brutality every day, he started to realize the true horrors of war. To find out what happens to him in the end, you'll need to watch the full video. I was talking about the amazing war movie All Quiet on the Western Front, released in 2022. The story revolves around 4 friends during the First World War. The year was 1917. 3 years had passed since the start of World War I. By then, Germany and the Allied forces were locked in a bloody battle on France's Western Front. Amid this chaos, a young 17-year-old boy eagerly joined the military to fight for his country. But once he entered the battlefield and the bunkers, what he saw shook him to his core. Surrounded by constant gunfire, bombs, and the deaths of countless people, his determination began to crumble. He was confused, scared, and unsure of what to do. As the fighting intensified, his fellow soldiers fell one by one, shot dead around him. Even in this chaos, his commander ordered him to leave the bunker and fight. Terrified, he ran through the battlefield, dodging bullets, trying to survive. Dead bodies piled up around him. At one point, he tripped and fell but still tried to shoot his rifle. His inexperienced hands couldn't handle the weapon properly. Finally, in desperation, he pulled out his military knife and attacked a German soldier. What happens to him after that will likely be revealed in the next scenes. In another scene, during a temporary ceasefire, we see German soldiers retrieving the bodies of fallen comrades. They place them in coffins for burial. Before burying the bodies, they strip the dead soldiers of their belongings and even their uniforms. Nothing could be wasted on the battlefield. Torn clothes were stitched back together to be reused. This shows how dire the situation was during the war. After this, the story takes us into a flashback. Here, we meet a group of young German students. Paul Bäumer, one of the boys, takes his friends to enroll in the army after getting into college. They were thrilled at the idea of going to the Western Front. To them, going to war was an exciting adventure, but they had no idea what horrors awaited them. Driven by emotions and patriotism, they signed up for war without any real experience or understanding of what it meant. As we've already seen in the opening scenes, their excitement soon turned into terror. The boy we saw in the beginning, the scared, inexperienced soldier, was Paul Bäumer. Before going to the battlefield, Paul and his friends attended a fiery speech by their school officer. This speech only fueled their excitement for the war. After enrolling, the 4 friends, Paul, Kropp, Franz, and Ludwig, received their military uniforms and supplies. Soon, under the command of a tough German sergeant, they began their journey to the Western Front. At first, they found the journey amusing, but during the ride, the sergeant warned them that war was no game. He told them that death would be waiting at every step of their journey. To survive, they would have to sleep in mud, walk long distances, and crawl over piles of dead bodies. Even after the sergeant strictly explained the harsh realities of war, the young soldiers still couldn't fully grasp its horrors. But soon they would face it firsthand. While traveling, they were forced to get out of their truck in the middle of the road. Another regiment needed the vehicle to transport wounded soldiers. Now they had to continue their journey on foot. A short while later, a plane flew overhead and dropped a bomb near them. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the sudden explosion terrified them. Paul's friends panicked and scattered in fear. After the explosion, the sergeant ordered everyone to put on their gas masks, but he was a little slow to wear his own. As punishment, he was forced to wear the mask all night during his night duty. Step by step, they finally reached the bunkers near the Western Front. By then, their excitement about war had almost disappeared. The sergeant removed Paul's gas mask and told him to get ready for battle immediately. The fighting had already begun between the German and Allied forces. Once the sergeant left, a middle-aged soldier named Kat arrived. He had been in the war for a long time and had seen how war turned men into monsters. Even their own sergeant had started changing. That night, after the gunfire stopped, heavy rain flooded the bunkers. All the soldiers were ordered to drain the water from the bunkers. Later, when the rain stopped, Paul and his friend Kropp were assigned night duty. During their shift, Paul suddenly heard movement in the distance. A split second later, a bullet struck his helmet. He fell to the ground inside the bunker. Luckily, his helmet saved his life. A senior soldier rushed to them and told them to move to a new position. The reflection from Paul's helmet had alerted the enemy to their location. At this point, it was clear that these young boys were nowhere near ready for real war. As the night deepened, their bunker came under heavy fire. One after another, artillery shells crashed down on them, destroying parts of the bunker. The 4 friends, along with other soldiers, took cover on the wooden bunker floor. That part of the bunker was stronger, so it hadn't collapsed yet. But it was only a matter of time before it did. Ludwig was so scared that he almost started crying. Terrified, he tried to run outside to escape. A senior soldier tried to stop him, but Ludwig slipped from his grip and ran out of the bunker. At that moment, another round of artillery shells hit the area. The explosion shook the bunker. Then the wooden floor beneath them finally gave in and started collapsing. All the soldiers ran outside to save themselves. The next morning, Paul woke up, trapped under debris. His face was covered in sand, mud, and soot. He looked so different that his own friends didn't recognize him at first. Finally, Kropp found him buried under the rubble and pulled him out. But there was no time to rest. They were immediately assigned to help the wounded soldiers. The artillery attack from last night had killed many soldiers. Once things calmed down a little, they had to collect dog tags from the dead soldiers. As Paul was collecting them, his foot hit something on the ground, a broken pair of glasses. It belonged to his friend Ludwig. Paul walked further and found Ludwig's body, torn apart. Seeing his best friend dead in just one night was too much for him to accept, but this was the reality of war. Holding back his tears, Paul forced himself to keep working. Months passed like this. By 1918, news came that Germany was losing ground in France. In just a few days, over 40,000 German soldiers had died. Surrendering seemed like the only logical option. Matthias Erzberger, the German state secretary, started discussions with the German high command about ending the war. Meanwhile, Paul and his friends had made a strong bond with the older soldier, Kat. One day, during a break from fighting, they were starving. While walking, they heard a duck quacking from inside a French house. They decided to steal it. Paul and Kat snuck inside and managed to grab the duck. But the house owner chased them with a dog. He even fired his gun at them while they ran. Somehow they escaped with the duck. That night, they had a feast. At that time, they were stationed in Champagne, France. That short break from war felt like heaven. After months of fighting, they finally had a moment of peace. During their free time, Paul, Kat, and their friends often sat together and talked. One evening, Kat gave Paul a letter from his wife. Since Kat couldn't read, Paul read it for him. That's when he learned that Kat's son had died a few years ago. Kat had come to war to escape his pain. In war, personal loss seemed small compared to the bigger destruction around them. Even though they enjoyed their short break, another struggle was coming. The final battle between Germany and the Allied forces was about to begin. The next day, Paul and his friends were assigned a dangerous mission. They had to find 60 young soldiers who had gone missing for several days. Following the trail, they reached a large warehouse near the railway tracks. When they stepped inside, their hearts nearly stopped. All 60 soldiers were dead. Flies and insects buzzed over their lifeless bodies. The scene was more horrifying than anything they had ever imagined. Kat realized that the soldiers had died from gas poisoning, but the German generals didn't care. No matter what, they wanted to keep fighting. General Friedrichs, who was in charge of the German soldiers in France, ordered them to continue the war. Meanwhile, State Secretary Matthias Erzberger understood that Germany was on the verge of defeat. He believed that continuing the war was meaningless, so he boarded a train to France to negotiate peace with high-ranking officials. But on the way, his train was bombed. He had to escape and take a risky car ride to reach his destination. That night, German soldiers were suddenly woken up. The ceasefire negotiations had failed. The war was about to continue. For Paul and his friends, more horror awaited. Meanwhile, after arriving in France, Escalating tries to negotiate a ceasefire with the French generals. But Marshal Foch of France makes it clear. Escalating has only 72 hours to sign the surrender papers. If he refuses, the French and their Western allies will not stop the war. Escalating faces a tough decision. Surrendering will save many young German lives, but it will also mean Germany's defeat in the war. He is torn, unable to decide. On the battlefield, German soldiers begin their march. Under their commander's orders, they leave their bunkers and move toward the French trenches. Paul, just like before, watches his fellow soldiers die from bullets and bombs, but somehow he survives. As he gets close to the French bunker, he throws a grenade and then rushes inside, taking down several enemy soldiers with his bayonet. One enemy jumps on him, but Paul stabs him repeatedly with his knife, killing him. The brutality of war has changed him forever. His mind is no longer the same. With Katch and a few other soldiers, Paul manages to enter the bunker and clear out all the French troops. Exhausted and starving, they quickly grab the French soldiers' food and eat. But suddenly the roof shakes violently. When they rush outside, they see two massive tanks rolling toward them, bringing death in their path. The German soldiers fire at the tanks, but the enemy's heavy shells kill many of them. In the chaos, Paul's friend Franz gets separated from the group. Meanwhile, the experienced soldier Kat and Paul grab hand grenades and charge at the tanks. They manage to disable one of them, using it as cover to shoot more French soldiers. But soon the Germans are overwhelmed. The French counterattack with flamethrowers, burning German soldiers alive. Seeing no other way, the remaining Germans start running. Paul watches in horror as his friend Graf surrenders, only to be mercilessly burned by the enemy. Paul can do nothing but run for his own life. A bomb explodes nearby, and he falls into a ditch, covered in mud. Meanwhile, Escalating desperately tries to convince the German generals to surrender, but they refuse. They believe surrendering would bring shame to Germany. However, Escalating is determined not to let any more lives be lost. He finally accepts all of France's demands and requests permission from the German emperor to sign the ceasefire agreement. Back at the Western Front, Paul, Kat, and the remaining soldiers return to their bunker. Unable to hold off the French attack, they decide to retreat. But running with so much ammunition on his back, Paul struggles. Through the chaos of bullets and explosions, he stumbles and falls into the mud again. Luckily, German reinforcements arrive, forcing the French to retreat. In the middle of this madness, Paul finds himself in a trench face to face with a wounded French soldier. Without thinking, Paul stabs him multiple times. But as the man starts dying, something shifts in Paul's heart. He watches in horror as the soldier gasps for breath. Overcome with guilt, Paul tries to help him, even apologizing over and over. When he finds a photo of the man's wife and child, his heart breaks. He holds the dying man and cries, realizing how deeply the war has changed him. But soon hope spreads among the German soldiers. Word arrives that Escalating has secured permission to sign the ceasefire. This means the war is finally coming to an end. Soldiers celebrate, knowing they will soon return home. Paul returns to the quarters and meets his injured friend Taden, who is lying on the ground with a bullet wound in his leg. Seeing Kat still alive, they both feel relieved that at least two of them have survived. They manage to get some food and bring a bowl of soup for Taden. But then something happens that they could never have imagined. Instead of drinking the soup, Taden takes a fork and repeatedly stabs his own throat. Blood spills as Kat and Paul try to stop him, but it's too late. Before dying, Taden says he does not want to live as a cripple. His tragic death leaves Paul even more broken. Kat tries to comfort him, saying, "War is like water. No one wants it, but it comes anyway. The ones who died are free from this cruel world. But we, the survivors, have to live with the memories of this nightmare." Meanwhile, Escalating's efforts finally pay off. The ceasefire agreement is signed. Though he tried to make some of France's terms easier, Marshal Foch refused to make any changes. Germany had no choice but to surrender, even though its generals were furious. But something terrible is about to happen. Even after signing the ceasefire, General Fredericks gathers the German soldiers. Instead of telling them they can go home, he gives a shocking speech. "We are surrendering like cowards," he says. "But I want our final moment to be a victory. Before the ceasefire begins, we will launch one last attack on the French." The soldiers are stunned. They thought the war was over. Some refuse to fight, but they are immediately shot for treason. Paul, however, feels nothing anymore. After everything he has seen, he is numb. He decides to fight one last time because he has nothing left to lose. At the planned time, the Germans launch a surprise attack. The French, thinking the war is already over, are caught off guard. But as soon as they hear the sound of marching soldiers, they grab their rifles and open fire. Bullets rain down, and Paul sees his comrades die around him again. But somehow he makes it to the French bunker. He throws a grenade and starts shooting. The rage inside him burns as he kills several enemy soldiers. Then, as he climbs onto the bunker's roof, a French soldier attacks him. They struggle violently until Paul grabs a brick and smashes it on the enemy's head. But before he can recover, another soldier jumps on him. They both tumble down a staircase, wrestling for survival. And then, it happens. Paul stands up only to feel a sharp pain in his chest. A French bayonet has stabbed him from behind. With great effort, he takes a few steps forward and leans against the bunker wall. His vision blurs. As the clock strikes 11, the ceasefire officially begins. The war is over, but Paul is already gone. Later, as soldiers collect the dog tags of the dead, a young soldier finds Paul's lifeless body. But instead of taking his tag, he leaves it. Paul had fought, suffered, and died. Yet in the records, his sacrifice would not even be acknowledged. His entire journey ended in nothing. The movie closes on this tragic note, reminding us of the horrors of World War I. 17 million people died, not for justice, not for peace, but because of the greed and power struggles of a few leaders. And in the end, war brings nothing but pain, loss, and destruction. That's it for today's video. See you in the next one. Until then, stay safe and take care.